The History of Philosophy, Modern Philosophy, Kant to the Present. Lecture 3.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, let us plunge back into Immanuel Kant for the last time this course, at least in terms of presentation of his views. Last week I gave you the essentials of the Kantian approach to philosophy, and I'll just remind you of them briefly. Our minds at birth are not tabula rasa, they're not blank tablets. They have a certain innate structure, not an innate content, but an innate structure. There are certain innate synthesizing or processing devices built into the mind, certain necessary forms of perceiving and conceiving. And when the data from reality reach our minds, those data are thoroughly transformed by these innate synthesizing devices so that law, order, all the basic characteristics of the world that we experience are impressed on the data by the actual operations of our minds themselves. We're at the end of the chain. We only experience the end product, the data as processed, as filtered. The result, we can be certain that the world that we experience will always obey certain necessary laws, have certain necessary features, and we can be certain of that because we create those laws. We only experience the world as we process it. Remember the example of wearing blue spectacles? Then necessarily everything you'd see was blue. We only experience the phenomenal world. As far as true reality, the noumenal world is concerned, remember, it's completely unknowable. We can't perceive it. We can't think of it. As soon as we perceive or think, our mental structure is involved, and that, of course, cuts us off immediately from any access to things as they really are. But that's no problem, because the world we live in and deal with, the phenomenal world, will go on, we're sure of this, will go on being a sane, rational, scientifically amenable world, guaranteed by the operation of our own mental activities. And thus the Copernican revolution in philosophy, our minds don't conform to things, things have to conform to our minds. Or in the other terminology I introduced you to last week, the primacy of consciousness, mankind's consciousness collectively actually creates the world we experience, and therefore we can be sure that that world for us will have certain necessary features. Now, near the end of last week's lecture, I started to give you Kant's proof of this theory. So far, it was all just simply hypothetical. And I said that we have to, according to Kant, distinguish two different questions. Can we prove that there are any of these a priori synthesizing activities on the perceptual level, what he calls contributed by the sensibility? And are there any of these a priori activities on the conceptual level, as he says, contributed by the understanding? And I gave you a brief summary of his arguments as far as the perceptual level is concerned. You remember his conclusion: space and time are the two necessary forms of perception imposed by our sensibility, by our faculty of sense perception. There are creations, and therefore they're, of course, absolutely necessary for us. Now, this much that we claim to have established last week in the presentation is assumed throughout the rest of the discussion this evening. All our experience has to be spatial and temporal. And Kant claims that he has proved that now conclusively, and that's going to be a firm peg on which we're going to hang everything else. Of these, I might mention parenthetically, time is the most crucial one for his subsequent argument, because time applies both to outer and inner experiences, both to extrospection and introspection. Inner experiences are not as such spatial. You couldn't say, for instance, that your memory of last week's lecture is 3 inches to the left of your love of your husband or whichever. So that space as such wouldn't apply to introspective data, but they're all in time. All human experience must take place in time, and this is the premise of all that's to follow. Now we want to pick up and look at his argument on the conceptual level. We want to prove that there are certain a priori synthesizing activities our minds perform on the conceptual level. In other words, certain necessary ways in which we must think or conceive as distinct from perceive. These a priori conceptual forms Kant calls the categories. And so you actually have two terms. For space and time, which operate on the perceptual level, he doesn't call space and time categories, he calls them forms of sensibility. But the a priori concepts contributed by the understanding he calls the categories. And what we want to know is, what is his proof of the existence of categories? Now, I'll give you a warning in advance. The presentation for the first half this evening is going to be far and away the most abstract and complicated of any lecture in this course. Kant's argument is extraordinarily long, abstract, complicated, technical. I will lead you through a maze of tortuous connections, one step allegedly leading to the next, etc. If you get upset, console yourself with the thought that we're going into this much technicality strictly because this is the core of his argument and has been enormously influential, and I promise not to get this technical again for the remainder of the course. Even so, I may say, and I don't think anyone could present intelligibly his full argument in less than 4 or 5 hours, which obviously I can't do here. So I'm going to give myself a much more modest assignment this evening. I'm going to give you an indication, which is going to take us some time in itself, of his method of approach, an indication of the method by which he proceeds to get us at least part way to the categories. Now, to be fair to him at the outset, I should say that I'll have to omit points that he regards as crucial to his argument. If you want the full exposition, it's given in this 2-volume account by Patton that I mentioned last week. In defense of my own procedure, however, I will say simply that the parts I'm leaving out, as far as I'm concerned, don't make his conclusions any more plausible. They merely make it still more bizarre and fantastic than the part I'm going to give you. But in any case, for the record, I say I'm going to give you just an indication of his type of argumentation. Now, in regard to his proof of the categories, Kant divides it up into various separate sections. And he had a special penchant for terminology. He always liked to invent complex terminology to designate any particular passage of his writing. So that I will have to introduce you to some of this terminology simply so you can take notes. That will also be of benefit at cocktail parties. Of the many sections which altogether constitute the proof of his categories, 2 parts in particular will concern us tonight. First, we're going to look at what Kant calls the transcendental deduction of the categories. The transcendental deduction of the categories. I won't bother to explain that particular title. But in general, what he wants to do in this particular argument is prove simply that there must be some categories built into our minds. This section of the argument is going to be very abstract. It will not tell us what the categories are, simply that there must be some. There must be some a priori concepts built into the structure of the mind. In this section, in the transcendental deduction, so-called, he's going to try to prove that categories of some kind are required if we are to be able to have any knowledge at all of anything. In fact, even further, he's going to try to prove that categories of some kind are required if we're to be able to have any experience of anything, any perceptual experience of any kind. In other words, in the transcendental deduction, he is going to claims to be able to prove that if we didn't have categories, we could have no perceptual experience of any kind. We couldn't perceive people, houses, faces, etc. So he's going to entirely reverse Aristotle's view of the relation of percepts and concepts. Aristotle claimed that we start with percepts. They come prior to concepts, and then we form concepts by abstraction from percepts. In the transcendental deduction, Kant tries to prove that certain concepts must come in advance of percepts, and they're what make percepts possible. Now, assuming we could establish that much, that should presumably pique your curiosity, and you'd want to know, well, if there must be some categories, what are they? Which ones in particular do we have? And that section of the Critique of Pure Reason is called the metaphysical deduction of the categories. He attempts to specify what the categories are and give us once and for all an exhaustive inventory. Anyway, when we get to that part, I'll simply give you the list along with a brief indication of how he comes up with it. But the heart of it is the transcendental deduction. All right, take a deep breath and let us start. The basic premise of it, from which everything else follows, he claims, is that human experience is always the experience of wholes. That's with a W, W-H-O-L-E-S. The experience of wholes, which are, however, never given directly to us in sense perception. By a whole, we mean simply a number of elements or fragments united together, put together into one totality. And Kant's basic premise here is that if we attend to what's actually directly given in the process of sense perception, we are never given a whole in any one frame of perception. We're always simply given a series of momentary fragments of experience, each of which lasts for the split second, for the instant, and then is replaced by the next, and then the next, and so on. For instance, consider looking at a house, just to give you an example. Now, we all agree we can perceive a house, and of course so does Kant. But he says, how? If you went by the actual direct given at each instant, all you get is a series of fleeting glimpses of different aspects of the house. To simplify, for instance, first you look at the front, and of course you can't take the whole sweep in one shot, so you look at one side of the front and then the other side, and maybe your eye roves to the cornice and the moldings and the door and the doorbell and the panels on the door and the windows. And each of those succeed each other. You get a quick shot and on to the next and on to the next. And then, of course, you have to go around the side and do the same thing, get a whole bunch of shots of different aspects of one side and the other side and the back and the roof and the chimney and the sidewalk. You get the idea. We get a series of momentary views, each lasting an instant, each rapidly succeeding the next. We get one fragment, then another, etc. We can't take in the whole house in one glance. In terms of our actual experience, we have a stream of momentary data. Yet at the end, we say, and Kant agrees, we saw a whole, namely a house. The question is, how? How can we, as we actually do, apprehend a whole when all we're given is a stream of fragments? Now, I could give you many other examples of these. Let me give you one or two just to show you the widespread applicability of it. Look at my face for a moment. Now, you can take in my face, and that's a whole. But again, Kant would say you're not given the face as a whole in any one split-second glance. If you watch yourself perceiving my face and you attend very carefully, you focus, for instance, for one instant on the tip of my nose, and you see only that tip. If you just focus on that, you don't get the rest of the face, just the tip of the nose. So what do you do to see the face? Well, you have to dart around mentally. You take a quick glance at the tip of the nose, and then at the curve of the lips, and then the lines in the forehead, the color of the cheeks, and the shape of the ear, etc. You rove back and forth. You get a whole series of fleeting momentary fragments. You don't take in the face as a whole in one shot. Yet we perceive the face as a whole. Or, if you want another example, the 3 knocks I mentioned last time. Remember from the question period. Now that's a whole. A series, in this case an auditory whole. You can take in 3 knocks and hear them as a whole and say, I heard 3. And yet you hear one, and then it's gone. And you hear the next, and then it's gone, and then you hear the next, and then it's gone. Now, our question is then, What must our minds have done if this fleeting series of momentary fragments of experience is to yield an apprehension of wholes, as we all agree it does? Now, the first thing to note for Kant is that it must have done something. If we simply passively perceived one fleeting fragment, and then it was gone, it just vanished from our consciousness, and then the next, and it was gone, and then the next, and it was gone, etc., we'd never get a whole. We'd never get a house, a face, a series of three knocks, or whichever. Now, the salmon is supposed to be like this. Now, perhaps this is unfair to salmon to use this as a lowly example, but even if the salmon isn't like this, let's imagine just a contrast. The salmon, for instance, is supposed to be such, I don't know how they would establish this, but in any event, just as a pedagogical device, it's supposed to be such that if a salmon hears a knock, by the time the next knock comes, the first one is wiped out completely, and he starts all over from scratch like a newborn salmon, and he hears the next knock, and that's gone, and then he starts over from scratch and hears the next one. Well, he could never get a whole. He couldn't get the series. Or if he was looking at my face, and if there were, as of course there couldn't be some equivalent of salmon language, he'd look at the tip of the nose and say, yeah. And then he'd look at the eyebrow, and by that time the nose would be gone completely, and he'd say, yeah, and that's all he would do is just have a series. He'd never get a face, you see. He'd have a meaningless play of momentary sensations, each gone when the next one starts. Now, Kant's starting point is, in effect, people aren't like this salmon. We can take in wholes, even though we're not given them. All we're given in experience is what the salmon is given, the fleeting fragment of the instant. So our minds must do something to this data to yield an awareness of wholes. What must it do? Well, obviously, to lead you step by step, it has to engage in an act of synthesis, right? It has to engage in an act of synthesis. It has to put together into a whole all the fragments that are given to it in successive moments. If our minds didn't constantly engage in synthesizing sensory data, binding them together into wholes, we'd be like the salmon. What we have to do is take each fragment, connect it to the preceding ones and the subsequent ones, so that at the end of all of the series of them, we have them all together in one frame of consciousness, and that's how we apprehend a whole. So to experience a whole, we have to perform an active process of synthesis. Well, what does synthesis require? It's going to be a series of, and what does that require, and what does that require, and so on, and at the very end, we'll get categories. What does synthesis require? Well, obviously, we have to have the ability to retain these successive fragments even when they're no longer being directly perceived. We have to be able to keep them in our memories as we go on to the next fragment. Somehow we have to be able to remember and keep before our minds the earlier fragments as we go on to the next. If we forgot each preceding one completely, we'd be like the salmon. Each successive fragment would be brand new. We could never get the idea of one knock coming after the other. If the salmon could count, so to speak, it would hear one, and then that would be one again, because it couldn't retain the preceding one, and that would be one again. It would start all over each time. Well, now we ask, how is it that we're able to keep before our minds the fragments from the past that we are no longer experiencing? How can you keep my nose, so to speak? These are my own crude examples, but it gets very abstract without examples. How can you keep my nose, so to speak, before your mind when you've already moved on to perceiving the lips, or the first strike before your mind when it's no longer there and you've moved on to hearing the second? Kant's answer is, we have to reproduce in our imaginations, in the form of an image, the earlier elements of the series. We have to reproduce mentally, in the form of an image, the earlier elements of the series. We have to actively recreate in our mind's eye, so to speak, an image of each of the earlier units as the series progresses, and keep those earlier images alive before us as the new ones are coming in. until by the time the series is completed, we can put all of them together, all the images of the past that we've reproduced, combine it with the last member of the series, synthesize, and form a whole. So we're this far now. If we're going to have an awareness of wholes, we have to actively reproduce in our imaginations the earlier fragments, and then combine these fragments in such a way as to get a whole. And now, how are we able to do this? Out of all the fragments that we experience moment by moment, how do we know which ones to reproduce in our imaginations in order to end up with a certain whole? And how do we know how to synthesize them in order to make the appropriate whole? That's the question. Give you an example. You're listening to the three knocks, and suppose right after the second one, somebody sneezes. So you actually hear knock, knock, sneeze, knock. See? That doesn't bother you at all. You're still able to see, to say, I hear three knocks. You don't bother to reproduce the sneeze in your imagination and add it in. You simply say, that's irrelevant. I'm listening to a progression of knocks, and the sneeze is simply irrelevant, so you just let that drop away. You don't bother to reproduce it. Or you're looking at my face, and as your eyes are darting around for a moment, my fingers come over my face like this, and you get, as part of that series, the experience of my fingers on my cheek. But when the time comes for you to put it all together and get a face, you just simply discard that experience of the fingers as irrelevant. You don't build it into my face so that I've got fingers coming out of the face. You say, that's not part of the face series, you see. Obviously, then, in any process of synthesis, we've got some criterion of relevance. We have some knowledge of a rule which tells us, of all the fragments that we get pouring in on us, what is relevant and therefore to be reproduced in order to reach any particular whole, and which ones are extraneous, to be eliminated, forgotten. We need a rule to guide us to know what to reproduce from the past. And we need a rule for a second reason also, even as apart from the issue of relevance. We need a rule to guide us in performing the synthesis, to tell us, in effect, how to put all these disconnected fragments of experience together in order to end up with a house, a face, or whatever. Now, a face, for instance, is a series of elements which are related in a certain way, which are put together in a certain way. Now, if you look at a face, you know, obviously, the forehead is on top, and then come the eyes, and one eye is on the left, and one is on the right, and then comes the nose in the center, and the mouth, and the chin, and, you know, they all have, it's a series of elements put together a certain way. Now, you could have taken the same elements which you experienced successively, reproduced only relevant ones, no fingers, etc., and yet theoretically combined them in grotesque ways and never get a face. Put the lips together, you know, so they're cupping under the eyes with the chin growing out of the nose, and etc., and have some horrifying monstrosity which wouldn't be a face. And yet we don't do this. No matter what order we experience the fragments, we always put them together in the same order. We know how to synthesize them. In other words, we must have some rule in our mind telling us how to put them together so we'll end up with the appropriate whole. In other words, to reproduce the relevant elements, we need a rule in each case to tell us what to reproduce. And to synthesize them properly, we need a rule in each case to tell us how to synthesize. If the mind didn't have the knowledge of these rules, we never could synthesize. And if we couldn't synthesize the data, then we would never have the awareness of wholes, and we'd be back in the case of the salmon. But our premise was that we're not salmon, and so we must therefore have the rules that guide the synthesis. And now all we have to ask is, what sort of rule would give us the knowledge we need? And Kant's answer is, only a concept of the kind of whole we're synthesizing could serve as the rule to guide our synthesizing activities. It's only because we know what a knock is, because we have the concept of knock, that when you hear the sneeze, you discard that as irrelevant. You know, well, that doesn't count because it's not a knock. And therefore, it's having the concept knock that gives you the criterion of relevance. Only because you have the concept of face, you know what a face is, that you simply discard your experience of fingers as irrelevant in forming a face. In other words, only a concept of the whole that we are synthesizing could give us the rule as to what's relevant and irrelevant. And the same thing is true for the issue of how to synthesize, how to put the fragments together. Only because we know what a face is, in other words, have the concept of face, do we know in what order and in what relationships to place the elements that make up a face. Only because we know, to take the other example, what a house is. In other words, because we have the concept of house, are we enabled to synthesize the doors, windows, roofs, walls, doorbell, etc., to put them all together in such a way that we get a house at the end, rather than some grotesque nightmare, you know, of doorbells coming out of the window, which is down the chimney, which is coming out of the side wall, etc. A concept for Kant is a rule telling us how to combine many fragments into a unified whole. A concept is a rule telling us how to combine many fragments into a unified whole. Or putting it more simply, a concept for Kant is a rule guiding synthesis. And if we use his word for what I've been calling many separate fragments, he calls that a manifold. A manifold, simply lots of separate fragments. A concept is a rule telling us how to synthesize a manifold. Direct experience gives us only this manifold of fragments. Our minds create the wholes that we perceive by synthesizing that manifold under the guidance of a concept which tells us what we're trying to end up with, what kind of whole we're synthesizing, and therefore how to do it. Now, if you're still with me, we can summarize like this. Wherever there's perception of a whole, there must be synthesis by the mind. Wherever there's synthesis, there must be a concept guiding that synthesis, telling our minds how to perform. And what's the conclusion we derive? Wherever there's a perception of a whole, there must be a concept operating in our minds, guiding the synthesis, telling us how to produce that whole. Therefore, the exact opposite of Aristotle's view is true. It's not the case that first we have percepts and then we go on to form concepts. Kant claims to have established that percepts presuppose concepts. If we didn't have concepts, we'd have no way of knowing how to synthesize the data. If we couldn't synthesize the data, we would simply be back in the position of the salmon. The fact that we perceive wholes presupposes that we have concepts governing us. That's the governing the synthesis. That's the first step in the transcendental deduction. We have not yet proved the categories, which was our goal. Why not? Well, because all the concepts that we've dealt with so far, like knock, house, face, etc., are empirical concepts, says Kant. And the facts they denote are simply contingent. You know, according to Kant, as we've said, that kind of thing, houses, knocks, etc., are simply contingent. There could very well be a world without houses, without knocks, without people. And therefore the concepts in those cases are simply contingent concepts. They're not necessary. And therefore they couldn't be contributed by the mind a priori. The mind only contributes a priori something which is necessary, remember. So what we want to find are necessary concepts. Concepts inherent in the mind. Concepts which must govern all the mind's activities, no matter what. In other words, we want the categories. How would we get them? Well, now I remind you of the point we made earlier. Even though most of what we perceive is contingent, simply happens to be the case, certain forms of perception are absolutely necessary, namely space and time. We must perceive spatially and temporally. No matter what the content that we perceive, it must be spread out in time and, let's say, also space. Now, up to now, we've spoken as though space and time are contributed exclusively by the sensibility, by the faculty of perception. But what if we could now prove that certain concepts were necessary in order to perceive spatially and temporally? What if we could prove that the very experience of space and time itself presupposed the operation of certain concepts? That if we didn't have certain concepts guiding our mind's activities, we could never perceive spatially or temporally. Well, if we could prove that, then we could say that the concepts in question, the ones that are required to enable us to perceive space and time, those concepts would have to be absolutely necessary, because space and time, as we know, are absolutely necessary, at least to us. If space and time are necessary, and that we claim to have proved, and if they require and presuppose the operation of certain concepts, then those concepts must be necessary. And of course, if a concept is necessary, it has to be non-empirical, because we can't get necessity from experience. It must be a priori, must be contributed by the structure of the mind, and a concept contributed by the structure of the mind is a category. So all we have to ask now is, well, why would a concept be required to perceive spatially and temporally? Well, we know, if you recall and can retain this, we know that a concept is a rule guiding synthesis. Remember? And that wherever there is synthesis, there must be a concept telling us how to perform the synthesis. So, if only we could show that the experience of space and time requires us to perform a synthesis, that would prove that it requires one or more concepts, and then those concepts have to be necessary since space and time is necessary. So now we ask, I'm getting near the end in case you wonder, but we're almost there. Does the experience of space and time require an act of synthesis on the part of the mind? Because if it does, we know already from the house face type examples, wherever there's synthesis, that requires a concept guiding and governing the synthesis. Does the experience of space and time require acts of synthesis on our parts? To which Kant's answer is yes, clearly it does. Any experience of space and time, he says, is the experience of a whole, in the sense that we used that earlier. And yet it's not directly given to us as a whole, merely a series of fleeting successive fragments. So if we're to be aware of the whole, we have to reproduce the earlier fragments and synthesize them with the later ones in order to give us the awareness of the whole. Take any unit of time you want, because his argument, he claims, would work whether you took a minute, an hour, a day, a year, etc. Now you can be aware of that stretch of time, of a minute, an hour, a day, a year. In fact, you couldn't be aware of things like that. If you couldn't, then you couldn't perceive temporally at all. That's the meaning of being able to perceive temporally. You can be aware of a stretch of time. Yet in each split second, says Kant, we're only given that split second. In direct experience, we only get now. And then it's gone. And now. We get a series of split seconds. If we were like the salmon, each of those split seconds would vanish. And by the time we got to the next split second, the preceding one would have completely been obliterated in our mind. We'd never be aware of the passing of time. We'd never be aware of a stretch of time, of a temporal progression. In other words, we'd never be aware of time. How is it that we can be aware, then, of a stretch of time? Only if we reproduce the earlier moments of any particular temporal stretch, even after they're no longer confronting us. We have to reproduce all the earlier moments and synthesize them with the present one in order to end up with an awareness of a stretch of time, whether a minute, an hour, whatever it happens to be. In other words, the experience of any unit of time requires an act of synthesis on the mind's part. The manifold of temporal data, as he would put it, has to be reproduced and combined to yield an awareness of that unit of time. And the same is true of space, I may add. You can't, for instance, take a mile in one glance. You successively get a little bit of distance and another and then another, and you have to retain the previous bits as your eye goes across the mile, and that means you have to, according to him, reproduce them in your imagination, keep them all before the mind's eye, and then synthesize them into a mile, and the same would be true of an inch or a light year, whatever it happens to be. So the perception of any stretch of space or of time requires an act of synthesis on the part of the mind. But we know, I tried to emphasize, although to be sure I said it very rapidly, but nevertheless, wherever there is synthesis, there must be a concept guiding that synthesis, telling our minds how to perform it. Else, remember, we wouldn't know how to reproduce, what to reproduce, how to synthesize. Remember the case of the house. So we have this situation. The experience of space and time requires synthesis. That means it requires concepts to guide the synthesis. And these concepts must then be absolutely necessary, because without them we couldn't engage in the synthesis that gives us space and time, but space and time we already proved is absolutely necessary. And therefore the concepts that it requires must be necessary. And a concept, if it's necessary, can't come from experience. It must be a priori, built into the mind's structure. And therefore there must be a priori concepts that the mind brings with it by its very nature, that's built into the mind, and therefore there must be categories. Q, E, D. Now that is undoubtedly the fastest presentation of at least one portion of the transcendental deduction on record, and even that was 35 minutes. A category, to summarize it, is for Kant an a priori rule built into the mind, instructing it in effect how to synthesize the spatio-temporal manifolds into wholes, and thereby making possible our perception of a spatio-temporal world. Without the categories, we couldn't perceive spatially or temporally. But we must perceive spatially and temporally, therefore we must have categories. Now that is the essence of the transcendental deduction. Now, to be fair, I want to utter 3 unintelligible sentences, just to be fair. I trust that it has not been unintelligible up to now. You may think that this is incredibly complicated, but the fact is I've only given you half the transcendental deduction. There's an entire section which I omitted. So I'll merely indicate, without any attempt to make this very clear, the type of thing he goes on to try to do, and if you're intrigued by this much, you can go on and get the rest. So far, he claims to have proved that the experience of space and time requires categories. But then, of course, the question could still be, how do you know the categories will continue in operation? How do you know they're really necessary and therefore reliable? That's the question that many of you asked in the question period last week. Well, in order to do that, Kant tries to hook the categories to still something else, which of course he gives one of his typical names to. He selects a certain feature of human consciousness. What it is here irrelevant. Let's just call it X, because I'm just indicating the type of thing he does. His actual name for it, if you care, is the transcendental unity of apperception. But we can just call it X for here. There's a certain feature of human consciousness he claims to have discovered, which is such that it is absolutely intrinsically necessary. And he claims to be able to show that you couldn't possibly have human consciousness without this X feature. And he claims to show that this X feature, of course he doesn't call it X, I'm calling it X because it's too long to say transcendental unity of apperception, but he claims to show not only is this X inherently necessary, but it requires the categories in order to exist. And therefore it necessitates the category as long as it's there, and it must be there, and therefore all is well, you see. So we spelled the whole thing out. His whole argument has these stages. Space and time require the categories. The categories are required by X. X is absolutely unavoidable for a human consciousness, and therefore the categories are intrinsically necessary. And you can be guaranteed they'll operate as long as X goes on and X is assured. Now you see why he would regard this as crucial, because that's the X on which his finale depends. I'm not presenting it, however, partly because it's much longer and more involved than the part I already gave you, and partly because I do not, in fact, myself think it adds anything more convincing to what I've already said. As I said earlier, I merely want to give you an indication of his approach and type of argumentation, and that I think you have already got. If you're interested in the transcendental unity of apperception, you are free to look it up, or you can ask in the question period, and I'll do what I can then. Let's assume now that we've proved, just to continue with this presentation, that there must be certain categories. That would then bring us to the question, well, what are they? And that's what's called the metaphysical deduction of the categories. How will we find out what are the a priori concepts which necessarily are built into the mind and govern all our thinking? Now, we already are taking for granted we know they must be there. So it's just a question, in effect, we've got a room in which we know there are people, and it's just a question of finding out which people. We've already proved they're there, supposedly, and now we want to find out what they are. Again, I'll give you an indication of how Kant goes about it. When we were looking for the necessary forms of perception, how did we do it? Well, we watched ourselves actually perceiving. We watched our sensibility at work, and we found that there were certain necessary features in our perception. Well, if we want to find necessary forms of conception, let's watch our conceptual faculty, our understanding, as Kant calls it, at work, and see if we can detect something necessary in its operation. Well, you might ask, what's the work of the understanding? What is it that we do with concepts? And Kant's answer is, we use concepts in order to make judgments, in order to formulate propositions, statements. His commonest word is judgment. On a level of perception, which we share with the animals, we simply stare out blindly. We watch percepts go by. If you have concepts, you can organize your data into conceptual statements. All men are mortal. I am now teaching Kant, etc. So for Kant, the understanding, the conceptual faculty, is the faculty for passing judgments. That simply means making propositions, making statements. If then there are any of these a priori concepts that we're looking for, and we know there must be, if there are any categories, they must show up in the kinds of judgments that we make, in the kinds of propositions that we use as human beings. Well, how will we find them? Well, now observe that in every proposition, in every judgment, we can distinguish two components, which are commonly called by logicians the matter and the form of the judgment. The particular content we're talking about and the type of relationship we ascribe to that content, the way we put it together. I'll give you an example. I'll take three judgments. All men are mortal, all philosophers are poor, all geniuses are original. Now, in each case, the subject matter is different. The subject, you know, means what we're talking about. The predicate is what we say about it. The subject and predicate are different in each case. Men, mortal; philosophers, poor; geniuses, original. That's the matter of these judgments, the particular subject and predicate. And those, of course, are limitless. They can vary from judgment to judgment. But in the three statements that I gave you, even though the matter, the subjects and predicates differ, the relationship that I ascribe to them is the same. In all of those cases, I said all of the subject class belongs to the predicate class. All men are mortal, all philosophers are poor, etc. In other words, these judgments all have the same formal structure. All S is P, we could symbolize, you see, which is common to them all. And of course, there are many other forms of judgment besides all S is P. If I say some horses are not intelligent, some women are not voters, some students are not hardworking, again, my matter varies enormously, my subjects and predicate, but the form in those three cases is some S is not P. If I abstract away from the content, that's the structure in which it's embedded. And there are many other forms besides all S is P or some S is not P. Now for Kant, the content of our judgment, the particular S's and P's come from experience. If you remember from last week, Kant said, that is, he didn't say it last week, but we presented it last week, that all content, all matter of knowledge comes from experience. It's a posteriori. So if the understanding contributes something a priori, and we already know it does from the transcendental deduction, then it must be not the matter of judgments, but the form of judgments, the ways that we put together the subject and predicate. If the understanding contributes anything, and we know it does, it must be the concepts which tell us how to put together subjects and predicates to make judgments. Suppose it should be the case that there are certain necessary ways that a human mind has to use whenever it tries to relate a subject and a predicate. Certain necessary forms or types of judgment, so that no matter what we think about, we have to use these ways. They're absolutely inescapable. Then we could conclude these forms of judgment, not the content now, but the form, the structure of the judgment, must be contributed by the understanding independent of experience. If it's necessary, remember, we can't get it from experience. If there are forms of judgment that are absolutely necessary for us whenever we think, then those forms of judgment must be dictated by the understanding. So his conclusion is simply what the understanding gives us a priori is the necessary ways our minds put together subjects and predicates to make judgments. Its a priori concepts, the categories, are simply the rules specifying the basic kinds of relationships which human beings must employ whenever they try to function conceptually and put concepts together into propositions. So if we want to find the categories, all we have to do is ask, are there any basic kinds of relationships, basic types of judgment that our minds have to use whenever they think? And each time we find a form of judgment that's necessary, that means it's a priori, contributed by the mind, then there must underlie it a category, a priori concept. We simply have to list all the necessary forms of judgment, and to each one we'll just read off the corresponding category that makes it possible. Now, since Aristotle, logicians had been concerned to make lists of the forms of judgment, abstracting away from the matter, the particular subjects and predicates, simply to make lists of the forms of judgment that all human beings had to use regardless of the particular content. Kant is not original on this point. He simply takes over these standard lists of the types of judgment with certain amendments of his own, and then simply says to each type there must correspond the category that makes it possible. Now, you have to know that Kant had a passion for symmetry. Indeed, some people would say an obsession. He was desperate to show that we could end up with 4 different sets of types of judgment, each with 3 members. So he had to arrange the types of judgment into sets of 3, 4 sets of 3, giving us 12 as a total. And of course, there are means that corresponding to that, there's going to be 4 sets of categories with 3 in a set. In order to end up with this scheme, he had to constantly engage in the most unplausible type of classifications. And very often, he comes up with so-called categories that you wouldn't have the faintest idea. How is it related to the type of judgment which it's supposed to underlie and make possible? Now, I'm not going to try to labor this material because a lot of it is enormously stretched. I just want to briefly run through his list without too much attempt at explanation. And whenever we encounter some particularly bizarre non sequitur, I just simply will note it and pass by without comment. This is simply to satisfy your curiosity. How could he have come up with 12? Well, the first set of 3 revolves of types of judgment now, revolves around what logicians call the quantity of the judgment. That simply means how much of the subject class are you talking about? And we have, says Kant, 3 possibilities. The universal judgment, you don't have to bother copying these technical names down if you don't want, but you can if you want. The universal judgment, that's all SSP. All men are mortal. All pigs have snouts, etc. When you talk about all of the subject class. Then what logicians call a particular judgment. That's when you talk about some members of the class. Some SSP. Some women are intelligent. Some horses are rapid, etc. And then finally is what it was called the singular judgment. That's when you talk about one particular member of the subject class. I say, for instance, Socrates is mortal. That particular woman is tall, etc. Now, all logicians agreed, and so does Kant, this particular trinity is entirely necessary. Take any judgment you can imagine or conceive, anything whatever, no matter what you're talking about. And either you're talking about one member of the subject class, or some, meaning more than one and less than all, or all. You got no way out but to think in terms of one, some, all. Well, if this is a necessary form in which the human mind must think, then there has to be a category corresponding to each, which is what gives it its necessity and makes it possible. How is it that we are able to think all SSP? Now, of course, the S and P we get from experience, but how are we able to grasp the relationship all SSP? Well, says Kant, only because we have the concept unity. When we say all SSP, we're treating all S as one unified group. If we didn't have a concept of unity, of one group, we could never make the judgment all SSP. We couldn't put them together as one, you see. Therefore, the universal type of judgment is made possible by the category unity. The some SSP type, the particular one, well, that one, we had to have the idea many in order to get the idea some. And that, he says, is what makes that possible is the category plurality. We had to have the idea more than one, some, a number, you see, in order to be able to think some SSP, and therefore the second category is plurality. And as for the singular, this SSP, Socrates is mortal, from that he gets, believe it or not, the category totality, presumably on the grounds that the total of Socrates is mortal. He says, by the way, that he is not going to define the categories, and therefore I will follow him and not provide definitions. What it comes to is this: our minds are built to think in quantitative terms. We have, in effect, a unity filter, a plurality filter, a totality filter. And if we didn't have these, we could never organize our concepts into the form of universal propositions or particular propositions or singular propositions, which means we could never think all, some, one. In other words, we could never judge at all, since judgment requires one of these three forms. But since we do judge in these ways and they're necessary, then the concepts which make them possible must be necessary. In other words, must be categories. A person might fail to have any particular S and P, the concept of it, but he couldn't function at all on the conceptual level if he didn't have the concept all, some, one, or in Kant's terms, unity, plurality, totality. These are the necessary preconditions of conceptual thought. They are, therefore, mind-contributed categories. Now, if you get the pattern, we can run through the rest quickly, because the details are really insignificant. Besides the issue of the quantity of judgments, logicians for a long time had distinguished what they call the quality of judgments. That essentially pertains to whether it's affirmative or negative. Here again, Kant has to come up with three forms. Two of them at least are reasonably clear. On the one hand, there's affirmative judgments where you say that something is the case. Socrates is mortal. 2 and 2 is 4, etc. Now, what makes it possible for us to think something is so? Well, we have to have the concept reality. And therefore, the concept reality is a presupposition of the affirmative judgment and must be an a priori category, notice. And he claims you couldn't get reality from experience. We have to have the concept reality to even think anything is the case. As soon as we think is the case, that presupposes the concept reality. So to the affirmative judgment, from that we get reality. From the negative type of judgment, such and such is not the case, what makes it possible for us to think that? Well, we don't experience a not, and yet we must have the concept of the not in order to think S is not P. And this one is reasonably clear. That category he calls negation. The concept negation is what makes possible negative judgments. Now you'd be probably curious to know what could the third one possibly be. Once it's got affirmative and negative, I just am going to say this with a straight face. The third one is of the form S is non-P. In other words, Bill is not intelligent is negative, but Bill is unintelligent is a different type of judgment, he claims. Because it's positive in form, I'm saying Bill is, but it has a negative predicate, unintelligent, you see. So it's a sort of a mixture of the preceding two, which he calls an infinite judgment, presumably because it doesn't tell us very much about what Bill is and leaves open infinite possibilities. And what makes this possible, he claims, is a category of limitation. I guess on the idea that it limits Bill. You see that whatever he is, he's non-P. So. Now, you should be able to see that just before we go on, that more than one category applies to each judgment. If I say all men are mortal, well, I had to arrive at that, I first had to perceive an individual man, which means in his terms I had to have the concept totality. And then I had to grasp many of them, which means I needed plurality. And then I had to put them all together into a group, which means I needed unity. And of course, in the act of grasping that they are mortal, I had to grasp that they were not immortal. So I needed reality and negation. All those categories had to operate. Don't ask me about limitations. Had to operate in order to make the simple judgment, all men are mortal. Now, some Kantians go on to claim that all 12 categories, and this is how they interpret Kant, must operate in any single judgment. And of course, if that's the case, then they would claim that just proves conclusively you cannot get these categories or concepts from experience, because to have the most elementary sense experience, this is green, I'd have to have a whole fantastic 12 conceptual categories operating to make it possible for me to think this is green, you see, and therefore obviously it must be inbuilt. Well, let's pass on to the last two trinities rapidly. The next one, of course, the big one for Kant. In this case, he finds the following three types of judgment: so-called categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive. Categorical, hypothetical, and disjunctive. Those are supposed to be three types of judgment. By categorical statement, he means roughly a simple, straightforward assertion. Socrates is mortal, this table is large, etc. It's a statement without any ifs, ands, or buts in it. What makes this type of statement possible? Socrates is mortal. Well, obviously, we have to have the idea of a thing which has certain qualities. Otherwise, we could never utter such a statement as Socrates is mortal. Kant's term for what we have been calling entity is substance. And for what we call quality, he calls attribute. And this is therefore the category of substance and attribute. That is what underlies and makes possible the simple, straightforward judgment: Socrates is mortal, the table is green, etc. If our experience wasn't organized by our minds into entities possessing certain characteristics, we could never make these categorical assertions. Yet we do make them. And we know that we can get entities from experience. Remember Hume from 2 weeks ago? Therefore, the concept substance or entity must be a category. Next in this trinity is the hypothetical judgment. That's a judgment of the if-then type. If it's raining, then the ground will be wet. If you put a match into a tank full of hydrogen, then you're going to have trouble, etc. That's a hypothetical type of judgment. What is the category that makes this type of judgment possible? Obviously, we have to have the idea to make this type of judgment of one thing necessitating the next, of one thing bringing about the next, of one thing causing the next. In other words, cause and effect must be one of the categories. This is the climax, you see, where we get to answering Hume. Cause and effect must be one of the categories, and we can read it off from the existence of the hypothetical judgment. Our minds have the category of cause and effect, which we clearly can't get from experience, remember again Hume, and yet which shows up whenever we say if-then. And therefore, that's another one to add to the list. Now, the third one here I'm going to pass by, because it has no plausibility at all. The disjunctive judgment is the judgment of the form either or. Either God created the world or it always existed. And from that, believe it or not, we read off the category reciprocity. But we've just passed that by. Then finally, just to finish the picture in a sentence, there is a trinity revolving around modality, as it's called, the mode in which subject and predicate are put together. And here you have three possibilities. You might say one possibility is S may be P. That's called the problematic judgment. Socrates may be sick. It's possible that he's sick. What makes that kind of judgment possible? The category possibility. So possibility and impossibility is an a priori concept which makes it possible for us to utter maybe. Then there is what's called the assertoric. That's a simple statement, something is the case. Not maybe it's the case, but it actually is the case. Socrates is happy. What makes that possible? Says Kant, the category existence. Existence and non-existence. Now you may ask, what's the difference between existence and reality? I've never found out the answer to that question, but in effect, if he hasn't taken care of reality in one set, it's come down on the other, but both existence and reality are categories. And the last is not S may be P or S is P, but S must be P. 2 and 2 must be 4. Socrates must be dead. And where did we get the must? Well, not from experience. That must be an a priori category, and that's the category of necessity. Necessity and contingency are also categories. Well, you got 12 categories into existence now. To be sure, very rapidly, you see the arbitrariness of this procedure of reading off the categories from the list of types of judgment. To sum it up, whenever we judge, we have to judge in certain necessary ways. The reason those ways are necessary is because that's the way our minds have to put together concepts. Those necessary forms of judging express the innate structure of the human mind. It's only because we possess certain inbuilt concepts that we're able to judge at all. In other words, to function conceptually. So when you utter any proposition, it's not only space and time that's contributed by the mind, but all of the crucial concepts that you need to utter any proposition. Unity, plurality, totality, reality, negation, causality, entity, possibility, necessity, existence, etc. All of those are a priori contributions of the mind, and you are then simply, whenever you think, thinking in terms and forms subjectively dictated by the nature of the human mind. You can't know any of them to have any applicability to reality. Reality is completely unknowable. Now, on that note, let us take a break. I assure you the worst is now over. All right, let us continue. We concluded that reality is entirely unknowable. I may say in the last part of the critique, after having established space, time, and the categories, Kant spends an enormous number of pages taking every aspect of reality which preceding philosophers had thought you could know something about in reason, and trying to demonstrate in each particular case that you could not acquire such knowledge. He sets himself to prove, and of course on the basis of what he has said in the first part of the critique, he's able to do so without difficulty. He sets himself to prove that you can't know anything about the self in itself. That is to say, about human consciousness in itself, because, of course, we have to think in terms of our a priori concepts, and that debars us from access to reality. You can't know anything about God. He then takes on the traditional proofs of the existence of God, which philosophers for hundreds and thousands of years have put forth, and blasts each one with relish, showing that they make use of the a priori concepts, and therefore the categories, and therefore those proofs are invalid. Obviously, for instance, you couldn't prove there's a God via the argument that, well, God must be the substance who created or caused the world, because substance, cause, etc. are all simply categories and inapplicable, and therefore God is unknowable in reason. He claims to prove we can't know anything about the universe as a whole, whether it's finite, infinite, and that any time we try to reason about the universe as a whole, we simply end up in grotesque contradictions, which he claims to specify. The conclusion he comes to is we have to restrict all knowledge exclusively, all rational knowledge, all knowledge involving concepts and sense experience. All that is restricted to the phenomenal world. Well, you might ask, do we have any kind of access of any sort to the noumenal world? And the answer, which may or may not surprise you, is yes, we do have a way of getting a glimmer. But that way is not by means of reason. It comes via ethics of all things. If you understand ethics properly, we will see the lead to the noumenal world. So let us then look at Kant's ethics and climax it with the insight it gives us into the noumenal world. So if you're making notes now, call it Kant's ethics. Prior to Kant, in the history of philosophy, there were two basic approaches to ethics. On the one hand, there was a whole group of philosophers who had claimed that you could establish moral judgments as absolute, objective, certain. And they thought that you could establish, for instance, men ought to tell the truth, they ought to respect human life, you ought to keep your promises, it's wrong to kill an innocent man, etc. They were the absolutists in ethics. But prior to Kant, they were all anti-empirical. They did not think you could base ethics on experience. If you ask these philosophers, well, how do you validate your absolute ethical judgments? They gave you a variety of answers. For instance, Plato would have said, you have a recollection or reminiscence of what goodness is from your sojourn in a preceding life. Or Augustine, speaking for the Christians, would say, God gives you the revelations. And many of the modern rationalists said we were born with certain innate moral ideas which constitute the basis of an absolute objective ethics. In all these cases, these people believed in effect in a special intuitive faculty to let you know what's right or wrong, independent of sense experience. Now, Kant rejects this approach as mystical, arbitrary, irrational. He agrees with the goal of these philosophers. That is, he agrees that ethics should be a matter of absolute objective principles that can be demonstrated, but he doesn't think that appeals to reminiscence, revelation, innate ideas, etc., is acceptable. Well, the other school in ethics prior to Kant had been the empiricists. We're born tabula rasa. All knowledge, they claim, comes from experience. Therefore, all ethical knowledge has to come from experience. But of course, that confronted them with the question, how? How could we get ethical knowledge simply from observing the facts of experience? Hume claimed to reach a dead end at this point. Remember, I think we mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. How can you get an ought from an is? All we observe and experience is what things are, what people actually do. We can't observe an ought, taste a should, touch a desirability. We can't sense evaluations, and therefore how can we get them from experience? Well, what the empiricists had attempted to do to get around this, in effect, is to observe that human beings pursue various goals. And they differed as to what they thought the goals of human beings were, but they thought you could observe, as a matter of fact, that human beings do pursue various goals. And then morality for them would be a matter of prescribing the means of achieving these goals. The function of morality, according to the empiricists, was simply to tell you, if you want to achieve a certain end, then this is how to behave to get it. So Aristotle, for instance, said all men want happiness, and then proceeded in his ethics to outline the conditions of how to achieve happiness. Epicurus said all men want pleasure, and proceeded to outline his particular version of how to experience, how to achieve pleasure. The hope that the empiricists had for an objective ethics was in effect to find some one goal that all men, as a matter of fact, wanted, and then tell people how to get it. Well, will this do as an approach to an objective ethics? Kant's answer is no. Because he says the problem that the empiricists are confronted with is how do you validate the basic goal, the ultimate value? The basic goal constitutes the standard of value by reference to which all other values are validated. if you knew what your ultimate end was to be and you could prove that, it's comparatively easy to figure out the means of achieving it. But the question for the empiricist school is, how do they know what the ultimate end, the final, ultimate goal of human action should be? Should men pursue happiness or pleasure or the welfare of others or life or what? Now, the only answer of the empiricists prior to this period was, well, we just simply have to observe the ultimate goals that people actually do pursue. That has to be our standard. We can't observe an ought, so we're reduced to saying whatever ultimate goals, as a matter of fact, people pursue, that's where we start. That's all we can observe. Now Kant objects to that proposal, that way of approaching the construction of an ethics on perfectly valid grounds. He says either men have a choice about their basic goals or they don't. If they don't have any choice about their basic goals, that means they're determined. They have no control over their behavior, and consequently, no ethics is necessary or possible. If their basic motivation is set by their nature, and that dictates everything else, then they're outside the province of ethics, and we don't need ethics. If they do have a choice about their basic goals, and that's the precondition of discussing ethics, then the fact that everybody does, as a matter of fact, pursue a certain goal is irrelevant. Because the question of ethics, he says, is not what goals do men pursue, but what goals should they pursue. The empiricists seem to have no answer to this problem. No way to solve it just by observing men and their actions. And the result was that empiricist ethics always tended to subjectivism, says Kant. The empiricists said, in effect, granted you aim at X, whatever that goal happens to be, then so-and-so is how you should live. But if a man came back to them and said, why should I aim at X? I don't want it. Prove to me that X ought to be my basic value. The empiricists in the last analysis were helpless. They couldn't validate the basic goal. Now we can put this same point in Kant's terminology. An empirical approach to ethics, he says. In other words, an approach which would be based simply on facts of experience, gives us only what he calls hypothetical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives. An imperative means simply a statement to act a certain way, an injunction to action. A hypothetical imperative is an imperative of the form, if you want something, then do something. Hypothetical, we know, means simply if-then in form. And his point is that an empiricist can tell a man, if you want happiness, if you want success, if you want life, whatever the X is that he happens to pick, then do this, do that, etc. But he can't establish that the man ought to want the particular X. And the result, says Kant, is subjectivism. Anything goes. If the Nazis came on the scene, of course Kant didn't refer to them, but if the Nazis came on the scene, and they could just as well say, if you want the triumph of the Aryan race and the destruction of the Jews, then you should build concentration camps and mobilize the Wehrmacht, and etc., and so on. And apparently, that would be in no better or worse position than any others, because everybody simply starts with arbitrarily, if you want it, then do so-and-so. In other words, a hypothetical imperative, an imperative which tells you if you want to achieve a certain goal, do such and such, leads to subjectivism because there's no way to validate the basic goal. This is Kant's view. Well, what conclusion can we come to from this, he says? We have to abandon the idea that ethics prescribes means to achieving some end, because there's no way to validate an ultimate end. If ethics is to be absolute, objective, universally binding, if we're not to get bogged down in subjectivism, then moral rules can't be of the form, if you want to achieve such and such a goal, do this. Moral rules must not be in the form of hypothetical imperatives, but what he calls categorical imperatives. A categorical imperative has no reference to a goal in it. It has no if part to it. It simply says, this is what you ought to do, period. Not if you want to achieve happiness or the welfare of mankind or anything at all. Simply, this act is right and do it, period. And for Kant, if we're to have an objective ethics, it must be comprised of categorical imperatives. Moral laws must declare, in effect, certain actions are right in themselves, regardless of anybody's goals, anybody's purposes, anybody's desires, regardless of what they lead to, regardless of what their consequences are. Certain actions are simply right. And a categorical imperative is going to be a statement that tells us such and such a type of action is simply right, and you must do it, regardless of your desires, goals, regardless of the consequences. We have to then abandon the idea that morality is a means to an end. We have to abandon the idea that virtues are justified on the grounds of the values they lead to. Morality is no longer going to be a guide as to how to achieve some particular goal, how to gain some advantage, how to attain some result. It's going to be a series of categorical rules which it is simply our duty to obey because they're right in themselves, period. Now what we want to do is find out what are these categorical imperatives. Could we learn them from experience? Obviously not, because here Kant agrees with Hume. Can't experience what ought to be or what's right. You can only experience what is the case. We need to discover a moral law telling us that such and such, we haven't yet established what, is what ought to occur, and yet we can't get such a law by studying the world. Now, of course, if we could follow the Christian pattern, we would be okay, because God gave a series of at least 10 categorical imperatives, which we call the 10 Commandments to the Christians. And notice those are categorical imperatives. God doesn't say, thou shalt not kill if thy goal is the preservation of mankind and the achievement of human happiness, etc. He doesn't say, thou shalt honor thy father and thy mother because it'll lead to this result. He just says, do it, period. See, there's no footnotes and no etc. Now those are simply categorical imperatives, outright commandments that you must obey. And that's what Kant is looking for in ethics, for the reason I mentioned, but of course he can't get it straight from God because God is unknowable on his system. Well, what is his solution? How is he going to find the categorical imperative? Well, I don't think it should be too difficult for you to guess his solution, because we've been in this type of situation before. If you recall, we needed a number of laws telling us what has to occur. For instance, that there must be cause and effect, there must be entities, etc. And we couldn't get them from experience. And you remember Kant's solution. If you need a certain type of law, and you can't find that law in the world on the basis of experience, try the Copernican revolution. Try reversing the situation completely. And therefore, just as we said with causality, it's part of the structure of the mind. We bring it to the world. Let's do the same thing on the moral level. Just as our minds put together the noumenal data in various ways, with the result that we all necessarily think in terms of causality, substance, unity, and so on, well, let's say the same type of thing on the moral level. Let us say that our minds, on the moral or practical level, put together the noumenal data, process it pre-consciously, with the result that all of us necessarily, universally experience the sense that certain things categorically ought to be done, period. So you can think of it in effect, although he doesn't use any terms like this, as though, in addition to everything we've had so far built into us, there's a moral filter, in effect, on the order of the causal filter and the space filter. And after the data from the noumenal world goes through, we get the sense certain actions are obligatory. It's my duty to do them. It is what I ought to do. Just as causality is contributed by the a priori structure of the mind, so is morality. Well, do we have any proof that there is such a moral filter operating? Well, says Kant, yes, we do. Because he says we all have the sense that there are certain things we ought to do. And that that's certainly not the same as simply what we want to do. You can know, for instance, I want to do X, but I shouldn't. I want to watch television, but I shouldn't. I should be studying. Or you can know, I don't want X. I don't want to study, but I should. I ought to. We all have the sense, he says, that apart from any of our desires, wishes, hopes, etc., there are certain obligations we have. And yet, of course, how could we account for this sense that there are things we ought to do, that there are binding moral principles on us, if we had to rely strictly on experience? You couldn't get that ought, but we've got it. And therefore the source of that ought, of the moral laws it requires, must be within, must be in the structure of the mind. It must be the case then that certain moral commandments are built into the structure of our minds. That our own minds on this deepest noumenal level issue to us certain moral orders, certain commandments. So that after a certain processing, which is, by the way, the same for everybody, unconscious, universal, we all have the sense this is what we ought to do. There's in fact one such law built in, which is the categorical imperative with a capital C and a capital I. And if we can find that, we will then know how we should act and have solved the problem of morality. The question is, what is the moral commandment issued to us a priori by our own minds? What does our moral filter in effect order us to do? Now notice that it has to be very, very general, because it's something that's given to us a priori, independent of experience. So it couldn't be that we're born with, for instance, the commandment or the categorical imperative, don't rob banks, or always be nice to people. We couldn't be born with any such things, because banks, people, nice, etc., are all concepts that depend on experience. Those are empirical concepts. And the categorical imperative we're looking for is a priori, built into the structure of the mind. Therefore, it has to be an enormously general type of principle, the most abstract kind of moral law. The idea will be, first we discover it, and then, by a process of reasoning, we can, using it as our foundation, apply it to a variety of particular cases and deduce what our specific duties are in a whole variety of specific situations. So it's a very much parallel to his view on causality. We're born only with the general concept of cause and effect, but if you want a specific causal law, you have to study the facts as given in experience. Similarly, we're given this very abstract moral commandment, which I'll tell you in a moment, and then we learn to apply it as we acquire experience. Well, what could this abstract moral commandment be? Well, we start with the fact that there are things we ought to do. And if we only could analyze that sense we take for granted everybody has, that sense of obligation, things you ought to do. We don't know yet what they are, but we're going to start with that sense. And simply by analyzing what's involved in saying there's things we ought to do, we're going to arrive at what's the categorical imperative that we're looking for. What does it mean to say you ought to do X? Tell the truth, whatever it happens to be. Well, obviously it means, regardless of your personal feelings, your preferences, your wishes, your hopes, your fears, you ought to do it. This is something that's binding on you, not because of anything particular to you, your desires, etc., but simply because you're a human being, which means it's going to have to be applicable to all human beings. If there's something you ought to do, you ought to do it, regardless of your feelings. What Kant is getting at here is he's opposed to people who try to make an exception of themselves to a moral rule that they otherwise recognize. There is a sort of person who says, for instance, yes, people ought to tell the truth, but I don't want to in this particular case, so I'm going to make myself an exception to the general moral rule. Now, this is what he's opposed to. He's saying, in effect, if people should do something, then so should you. Inherent in saying that men have a sense there are things they ought to do is that anyone's personal feelings, desires, etc. is irrelevant. If something's a moral law, it is then a law applicable to everyone. No one then is justified in cheating on it or expecting other people to follow it while he breaks it. Now, we put the same thing another way and simply say a moral law must be universalizable. You take in that mouthful, universalizable. In other words, must be such that it could serve as a principle of action for all men. For all men. And that is actually all we know, a priori. That is the categorical imperative. I'll dictate to you a rather archaically worded English translation of the categorical imperative, since it's so famous you may want to take it down. It is act only on that maxim whereby, I'll read it once first and then go slower. Act only on that maxim whereby thou canst at the same time will that it should become a universal law. I'll say it slower. That's the categorical imperative. Act only on that maxim whereby thou canst. You can write you can if you think that would be preferable. At the same time will that it should become a universal law. Or another formulation he gives of it is, act as if the maxim of thy action were to become by thy will a universal law of nature. And commentators sometimes give this example, this elaboration to explain what he means. Before you undertake an action, identify the principle underlying your action. And then imagine that the fact that you took the action has a hypnotic effect on the totality of mankind, on every other human being, so that thereafter, in all cases and permanently, without exception, every human being will act on the principle you just acted. If you can, it's a possible state of affairs. If it's truly possible for everyone, without exception, all the time, to act on that principle, then it qualifies as universalizable. And that means it's perfectly fine. The categorical imperative is all in favor of it. On the other hand, if it's the type of action which absolutely could not be universalized, in order to be put into practice, it requires a contradiction. It requires some people to live by it, while other people violate it. Then it's non-universalizable, it's evil, you mustn't perform it. So you can think of that hypnotic test, so to speak. You have hypnotic power over all mankind, and the principle is it possible to universalize your action? That's all the mind tells us a priori. It tells us, in effect, conform your behavior to universalizable laws. Now we're armed with this principle. We simply go through the various situations in life trying to figure out whether any particular principle is or is not universalizable. If it is, fine. If it isn't, it's immoral. Now I'll give you a crude, simple example of a principle that no one ever put forth, but just to illustrate this, that would not be universalizable and therefore would be out. Suppose someone in a bizarre frame of mind should advance the following moral principle. Never buy a newspaper, always read somebody else's. Now you'd say right away, well, that just could not be universalized. In logic, it would be contradictory. Because if nobody bought a newspaper, there'd be nobody else's to read. The only way that you could possibly act on this advice is if somebody violates it and buys his own newspaper, and then you're counting on him to have one in order to not buy one yourself. That clearly would not be universalized. Now, do we have any more significant consequences from this principle? Because hopefully we do. And Kant thinks there's many, many crucial virtues he can prove simply by application of this principle. I'll give you one which is, without any controversy, the most plausible. Lying Kant thinks he can prove that lying is not universalizable. Now, you imagine that you're in some specific situation. You have to study for an exam, and you didn't, and the instructor asked you why not, and you're tempted to tell a lie and say, well, your father was sick and your mother had polio and so on, and that's why you couldn't do it. But you're an advocate of Kant's ethics, so you ask, is it universalizable? So you're tempted to lie, but you want to see if it's universalizable. So you ask yourself, could it become a principle of human behavior always for everyone to lie? To which Kant would say, no, this is literally impossible. It would be a contradiction. Why? Well, because part of the very concept of lying to someone is that the person you're speaking to accepts what you're saying as true. If everybody lied universally, they did nothing but lie all the time, every time they opened their mouth, nobody would believe anybody. Everybody would immediately attach the opposite significance to whatever anyone said. If I said to you, it's now after 9, since everyone's lying all the time, you'd simply say, he means it's not after 9. The word not would reverse its significance, you see, and you'd simply add a not into every statement that didn't have it. In other words, you couldn't lie if everybody lied. No one would believe anything. Universal lying is impossible. When you lie, you count on the fact that people generally tell the truth, and therefore you'll be believed in your particular lie. In other words, you count on the fact of being an exception to a rule that other people obey, and that's just what the categorical imperative forbids. The conclusion that Kant draws is lying as such, under any circumstances, is wrong, because the maxim or principle of lying is not universalizable. Now notice, this is a very special type of argument. He does not say, and I underscore this, if everybody lied, think what bad consequences there'd be. Think how unhappy people would be. Think of the human misery. He is not concerned with the consequences of behavior. These imperatives, remember, are justified on the grounds that they're categorical imperatives. There are certain actions which are right and others which are wrong, entirely independent of anything they lead to. Therefore, if you prove to him that if everybody lied, they'd all be miserable, he doesn't count that as an argument. But this particular argument against lying is that you simply couldn't do it. Not that if you did it, it would lead to bad consequences, but that it literally can't be done. It's impossible for everyone to lie. And therefore, lying is a sin. It's wrong. You have a duty never to lie. Now, he does the same sort of thing, or he tries to, rather. That's the most plausible example. For many other types of actions. He tries to take many commonly recognized virtues. For instance, that you should develop your talent, that you shouldn't murder other people, that you should help others. He's a strong altruist. He regards that as a virtue, and he tries to show that the alternatives in each case are not universalizable, and therefore these are required by the categorical imperative. Now, it's generally recognized that he fails dismally in this task. I'll give you just an indication on altruism, for instance. He's trying to prove, by deduction from the categorical imperative, that everyone has a moral obligation to sacrifice themselves for others, to help others, etc. He says to himself, well, now we ask, can this be universalized? Can the refusal to help others be universalized? And he says, well, yes, we'd have to grant that we could project a world in which each person lived independently, didn't sacrifice himself for other people, and didn't expect other people to sacrifice for him. But even so, even though we could project a non-altruistic world, no one could consistently will that this be a universal law. And you say, why couldn't anybody will that this be a universal law? He says, because down deep in each human being, there is the idea, someday I'm going to be in trouble and I want other people to sacrifice for me. And therefore, if I institute by my refusal to help others the rule, don't help others, I won't be able to cash in on their sacrifice for me when the time comes that I need it. Now that, you see, is a pretty hopeless attempt to deduce something from the categorical imperative, because all the person has to say is, well, I don't have the desire to be the recipient of somebody else's sacrifice. Now go and do something for me. Go and prove that by the principle of universalizability I should help others. Since you grant that you can universalize living independently and not engaging in sacrifice. Kant can't do anything. He simply distinguishes what he calls strict and lax duty, and lax duty amounts to those cases where he wants to show that something is required by the categorical imperative but can't really do it. That's not his definition, but that's what it comes to. The main objection that philosophers raise to the universalizability principle is that it's valid as far as it goes, but that it doesn't go very far. In other words, that it's true to say that a moral principle must be universalizable if it's valid, but that's not enough. After all sorts of things are universalizable. It doesn't therefore follow that you have any obligation to do them, or that it would even be proper to do them. For instance, I could universalize quite easily the following maxim. Whenever you purchase a book, always inscribe on the flyleaf, "To Kant with love." It could be universalized. There's nothing to say that the entire human race for the rest of their life couldn't do it, but you say this is ludicrous. Why in the world do it just because everybody could do it? So, in other words, it's true that a moral principle must be universalizable. That's a necessary condition, but obviously not sufficient. What we want to know is, of all the universalizable principles, which are the ones that we should act on? And this, of course, the categorical imperative does not tell us. And so the common objection is that this ethics is pretty empty of content. How would you tell? Well, if you were constructing an ethics in reason, you'd have to know, well, what goal are you after? What is your concern? What do you want to achieve? And then define your principles accordingly. But of course, for Kant, all reference to goal is out, because then it's simply, if you want to achieve this goal then, and it's hypothetical, subjective. So we have no reference to any goals, any consequences, any results, and we're left in the position of simply act on it if it's universalizable. All right, to pass to another point of great importance in his ethics, let's grant him to continue, that he has, by judicious application of the categorical imperative, generated a whole coded set of virtues. He claims he can prove that you should never commit suicide, for instance. You should always keep promises, you should help others, etc., and so on. We have still one more major point to grasp the essence of his approach to ethics. Why should we obey the categorical imperative? Assuming now that it gives us a whole set of concrete advice, why should we obey it? And Kant's answer is, you must obey it because it is your duty. Your duty, that's the key concept. It's ordered to you by the structure of the human mind. Notice, you do not obey it because you'll achieve success, prosperity, happiness, etc. It's a categorical imperative. It doesn't say, if you want to achieve happiness, then act on universalizable principles. For all we know, it'll make us miserable to act on the categorical imperative. But that doesn't make any difference. Kant says it is your duty to act on it. You must do it because it's your duty, period. Duty is not a means to happiness. It's an end in itself, ordered to us a priori. Phrase, you see, virtue is its own reward. And he quite openly says that behaving morally may make a person miserable. If so, he says, that's just too bad. The concern of ethics is not to achieve human happiness. It's for men to do their duty. And he is particularly concerned to fight the idea that happiness is man's ultimate moral purpose. He says at one point, if the function of reason were to achieve happiness, then nature made a big mistake. Because if nature had intended man to achieve happiness, it would never have given us reason. It would have just given us instincts. Instinct, he says, is the obvious way to achieve happiness. Live on the unthinking level like the animals. They're not tortured with doubts and indecisions and agonies and choices and questionings. They just simply do, so to speak, what comes naturally and in effect have a laugh a minute. Now nature did not, you see, so his argument is if nature had intended man's reason to be a means of achieving happiness, it would have made a big mistake. Nature gave us reason, and yet reason is not an effective means of achieving happiness. Reason must have some higher, nobler end. And in fact, he says, if you look around you, you find that the more a person cultivates his reason in the attempt to find happiness, the more unhappy he becomes. That is his claimed observation of the people around him. Conclude the function of reason is not to achieve happiness. The true purpose is wholly divorced from considerations of happiness. Reason has a higher, nobler end. What is it? Obedience to the categorical imperative as an end in itself. Who then is the moral man? The man that deserves praise, moral credit. Well, it's the man who does his duty because it's his duty. The man who does what the categorical imperative dictates simply because it dictates it, without any ulterior motives. And here Kant makes a very famous and basic distinction between what he calls acting from inclination and acting from duty. Acting from inclination versus acting from duty. Acting from inclination means doing something because you want to perform that action. There's some personal goal you're seeking after. It makes you happy. It achieves some advantage, and therefore you want to take it. That's acting from inclination. Acting from duty is doing something that's your duty because it's your duty, not because you have some ulterior motive, desire, goal, but simply your reverence for the categorical imperative. Now, it may be the case in a particular situation that your inclination and your duty point in the same direction. It may be the case that you want to do a certain action for personal reasons, and it happens to be the very action that your duty dictates. In such a case, says Kant, you should, of course, take the action. You still have to do your duty, but you don't get any moral credit for acting correctly in that situation, because your action is adulterated by your desire to do it. When would you get moral credit? Your action has to be not only, as he puts it, in accordance with your duty, it has to be done from the motive of duty. Now let me read you, because he is as clear on this point as anyone can be. Take the case of maintaining your life. Now Kant thinks that by the categorical imperative he can prove that you have a duty not to commit suicide. And I'll quote him now. He says, quote, "It is a duty to maintain one's life. But in addition, everyone has also a direct inclination to do so." I interpolate. They want to remain alive. They have goals they want to achieve. Continuing from Kant. "But on this account, the often anxious care which most men take for their life has no intrinsic worth, and their maxim has no moral import. They preserve their life as duty requires, no doubt, but not because duty requires. Therefore, they get no moral credit. Their action is in accordance with duty, but it's not from duty." Well, you say, when would a man get real moral credit for remaining alive? Well, Kant says, continuing the same quote, "On the other hand, if adversity and hopeless sorrow have completely taken away the relish for life, if the unfortunate one, strong in mind, indignant at his fate rather than desponding or dejected, wishes for death, and yet preserves his life without loving it, not from inclination or fear, but from duty, then his maxim has a moral worth." You get that? That's pretty clear, I think. Now, he is so thorough on this point that even on the virtue, according to him, of helping others, of altruism, you can have no inclination to it. Quote one last passage from him on this. You have to help others strictly as a duty. If you get any pleasure, satisfaction, etc., out of it, you lose moral credit. Quote, to be beneficent when we can is a duty. Now, there are many minds so sympathetically constituted that they find a pleasure in spreading joy around them and take delight in the satisfaction of others. But I maintain that in such a case, an action of this kind, however proper, however amiable it may be, has nevertheless no true moral worth, but is simply on a level with other inclinations. For the maxim lacks the moral import, namely that such actions be done from duty, not from inclination. Well, you say, when, for Kant, would you get credit if you sacrificed yourself and went around spreading joy for others? Well, he says, quote, put the case that the mind of a philanthropist were clouded by sorrow of his own, extinguishing all sympathy with the lot of others, and that while he still has the power to benefit others in distress, he is not touched by their trouble because he is absorbed with his own. And now suppose that he tears himself out of this dead insensibility. That's a typical Kantian type of phrase. He tears himself out of this dead insensibility and performs the action without any inclination to it, simply from duty. Then for the first time does his action have genuine moral worth. Now that is as unequivocally clear as one can make it. You get credit when your inclinations point in one direction and your duty in the other, and you fight your inclinations. You force yourself against your desires to do your duty. If you want to do what's right for personal reasons, you get no credit. To get moral credit on Kant's view, you have to want to do the evil and then resist temptation. Now it is therefore for Kant that human life, being moral, involves an inherent conflict, a struggle. It's a constant matter of resisting temptations, fighting yourself, pushing down your inclinations, sacrificing your interests, desires, in effect, effacing yourself entirely. If you don't go through this struggle of pushing down what you want, you get no moral credit. To be moral is inherently painful. Self-interest and morality are opposites. You remember Mayor Bascom in Atlas Shrugged, who said, lady, in this life, either you're good or you enjoy yourself, but not both. That is a disciple of Kant. Now, of course, I think it should be clear, I interject here a parenthetical comment from me. This view is the perfect perversion of the truth. On this view, the only person who gets moral credit is the man who has evil desires and then fights them. If you've achieved the state of having only virtuous desires, you get no credit. So, for instance, on this sort of view, John Galt wants to think and be rational. He doesn't have any struggle. He doesn't have any temptation in the opposite direction. He wants to. He gets no credit. Now, suppose, however, take James Taggart. He decided to reform. He went to his therapist, and he said, okay, I'll do it. I grant it's right. And he forces himself. Against all of his inclinations, he would much rather do his thing, so to speak, but he forces himself to think, and he sits there saying, I'm doing my duty because it's my duty. Well, says Kant, that's the morally praiseworthy man. Now I ask you, which of those two men is in a higher moral state? I'll give you as a simpler example. Suppose you have two neighbors. Neither of them will set fire to your house. One of them has no desire to commit arson. The other one, he's living an independent, productive life, and he's perfectly happy. The other one is just wild with passion to set fire to your house. But he says to himself, I have a duty not to commit arson. And therefore, I'm going to do my duty because it's my duty, even though he can barely keep his hands off the matches. Now, who is the most moral of those two men? According to Kant, it's the one, the dutiful non-arsonist. Now, as according to objectivism, the moral man is the one who forms his desires in accordance with objective standards of self-interest, and therefore he never has a conflict between his desires and his moral standards. But the Kantian type man inherently has such a conflict. The underlying view, in effect, is that human nature is a sewer. Kant actually in one place called it radically evil, and morality consists of fighting against your evil lower nature. Now I think the general similarities between Kant and the Christian ethics should be clear. Ethics is a matter of doing your duty. Kant, of course, was brought up as a very religious Protestant. It's a matter of commandments, although now the noumenal mind replaces God as the issuer of the commandments. It's a matter of constantly struggling against personal desires, against the problem of temptation, and the morally praiseworthy thing to do is renounce, give up, abandon your desires. Kant, in effect, is the main transmitter of the Christian doctrine of self-sacrifice on into the modern world, but in a much more extreme form than any of the Christians, or most of the Christians, had put it, because the Christians at least thought, most of them, that you could love others and enjoy the process and get some pleasure out of helping others. But for Kant to be, you get the idea, you have to do your duty because it's your duty. So that it's a much more extreme version of complete self-abnegation. This is why Miss Rand in one of her papers referred to Kant's ethics as viewing man as a shmoo, that little creature that completely effaces himself and turns into whatever you want him to be. Now we still have the climax to cap the thing, and then we're done with Kant. We have to get our means of access into the noumenal world. We start from the fact that there's a moral law. If you're giving this a title, call it God, Freedom, and Immortality, because that's Kant's famous phrase. We start from the fact that there's a moral law. Categorical imperative. We've established that. And we're now going to show that following from the categorical imperative, we must be able to find out something about the noumenal world. Now, I know you're going to tell me that it was supposed to be unknowable, but it turns out, as you'll see, that we can sort of know something after all. What can we know? Or sort of know. Well, if there's a moral law, we must be able to obey it. Morality requires free will. If we didn't have free choice, if we were completely determined, if we couldn't act any differently than we actually did, then of course there would be no point in telling us what we ought to do. The famous line, ought implies can. A man is leaping out the window, on his way down, you call out to him, you shouldn't fall. There's no use telling me I can't do anything else. In other words, morality presupposes free will, free choice. We know there's morality, therefore we know there must be free choice. But where will we find free choice? Well, we find it in the phenomenal world. Well, says Kant, no, can't find any free choice in the phenomenal world. Because the phenomenal world, remember, is governed by the causality mechanism. And as Kant interprets it, if every event has a cause, and the cause has a cause, and the cause has a cause, and so on all the way back, that everything that happens in the phenomenal world is strictly determined, and within the phenomenal world, nothing could have happened differently. In other words, he equates cause and effect with determinism, with the denial of free will. If you have any questions as to what's wrong with that, I'll be glad to discuss that point in the question period. But it's a very common equation, the assumption that cause and effect means the obliteration of free will. So we're in this situation. There must be free will, but we can't find it in the phenomenal world governed by causality. Where then? Well, where else but in the noumenal world? There must then be a real self, our self in itself, in the noumenal world, which makes real choices, which is really free, and which is therefore responsible for our actions here in this world. Because if it wasn't so, we couldn't have morality. So the solution to the age-old controversy of free will versus determinism is that they apply to different worlds. Determinism is true of the phenomenal world, and free will is true of the noumenal world. Now, of course, if you ask me what is this real self, that's unknowable. If you ask me how does it produce our phenomenal actions, that's unknowable. In fact, if you ask me can we really understand this point, I would say no, and so it can't. Now wait, so it can't. Take this case. A man robs a bank. That takes place in the phenomenal world, you see. Now, says Kant, the robbery as it appears to us, the phenomenal robbery, is inevitable, because it's part of the structure of cause and effect, and everything in the phenomenal world is determined. But in itself, it didn't have to take place, because it was chosen by our real selves in the noumenal world. Now, you might think, well, if it was chosen by our real selves in the noumenal world and they're free, then it didn't have to take place. But, and then you might think, if our real selves in the noumenal world had chosen differently, then it wouldn't take place. But of course we can't say that, because the phenomenal robbery had to take place no matter what happens in the noumenal world, because everything in the phenomenal world is entirely determined. So we're in this position that somehow there is a free will in the noumenal world, which is somehow allows us to hold ourselves responsible for what we do. In the phenomenal world, even though everything in the phenomenal world couldn't possibly have happened differently from the way it did, and even if the noumenal self had acted differently, the phenomenal self would still go on doing what it did. Now you say this is incomprehensible. Kant says the same thing. But he says that's no objection, because we understand why it's incomprehensible. It's incomprehensible because it pertains to the noumenal world, and that is inconceivable. And therefore the most we can do with the problem of free will and determinism is no, we must have free will, but how we have it and how it relates to the way we operate here, we've at least proved that we can't grasp the answer to that question. So much for freedom in that phrase, God, freedom, and immortality. Freedom in that phrase means free will. Now, I barefacedly add that much as Kant inveighs against happiness as the good or as the goal of life, he also says that the highest state of affairs would be the one in which a virtuous man achieved happiness. He says this on a different page. And that is, of course, a gross contradiction in my view. In any event, the very best possible state of affairs would be if a virtuous man were to achieve happiness. But, he says, here on earth, virtue does not lead to happiness. The wicked prosper, the virtuous suffer. To which I add parenthetically, that's because they follow Kant's ethics, but I'll leave that point out. In any event, he concludes, if justice is to triumph, if the virtuous are to get their just rewards and the evil their just punishment, there must be an afterlife where the moral scales are evened up, where the good are rewarded and the bad punished, and that, of course, presupposes that our noumenal self somehow survives the death of the phenomenal body, and that there is, and therefore immortality, and that there is some kind of supreme moral being who is awarding out the praise and blame, punishment and reward for our phenomenal performances. And that entity is, of course, God. Therefore, starting from morality, we can reach not only free will, but God and immortality. Now, of course, God and immortality are also noumenal. They're outside of any experience. We can't know what they are, but we're entitled to have faith in them. Not knowledge, says Kant, but faith. But he quickly says, not an arbitrary faith, because I've just shown you how they follow from morality. So as I've heard it put, it's an a priori faith. And now we've achieved, in effect, the capstone of the whole procedure, because we have saved religion from the onslaughts of the skeptics and the atheists. Every time prior to Kant, a religion has tried to get off the ground and put forth some argument for God, he was smashed by an atheist showing him all the fallacies in his argument. Kant claims now he has saved religion, saved God, immortality, etc., once and for all from the assaults of reason, because he's shown that this is simply a matter of faith that reason can't touch, reason having no access to the noumenal world. He says in the critique, I have found it necessary to limit knowledge in order to make room for faith. I've, in effect, put reason in its place. And he says, if anybody accuses me of coming to simply negative results, we can't know reality, I'll answer that I have the same function as a policeman, the criminal in this case being reason. I've put it in its place, I've kept it in the phenomenal world, and the door is now open for faith in the noumenal world. So much for a presentation of Kant's ethics and the conclusion that he draws for it about the noumenal world. Of course, as you see, his ethics all rests on the basic premise that there's no way to get an ought from an is, to get values from facts. That, of course, is the crucial issue, and this is where Ayn Rand's achievement in ethics is concerned, is particularly remarkable in relation to Kant. I refer you to the passage in Atlas, which I will not here present, where she analyzes the concept of value and shows that inherent in the very concept of value, or any of its synonyms or derivatives, is logically the holding of life as the standard. I refer you to the passage of it, that it's only the concept of life that makes the concept of value possible. If you grasp that and its implications, you then know the central proof required to answer Kant on the ethical level, because you would show how the concept of value can be defined objectively and validated simply on the basis of experience, and therefore how you could establish an objective ethics without these a priori moral filters. This objectivist approach I will elaborate when we get to objectivism, so we'll return to it later. Now, I had wanted to make some criticisms of Kant in a general way, but we are over time right now, so I will, I think at this point, suspend the lecture, and we'll have at least time for some questions. Next week, before we go to Hegel, I'll give about 15 or 20 minutes at the outset to what I regard as the central objections to the whole Kantian approach in epistemology. Of course, you're free to ask questions in the question period covering objections. We may cover some of them then. All right, we'll draw a line here next week, finish off some critical remarks on Kant, and pick up with its consequences. Thank you. Minds support the notion of an a priori content. Well, if you understand by concept anything like what Aristotle or objectivism understands by concept, namely an integration ultimately of perceptual data, if you understand that by concept, then of course any concept has a content. It has a series of ultimately sense experiences that it stands for and unites. But that is not Kant's concept of a concept. His concept of a concept is simply a rule to guide synthesis. And in the case of the a priori concepts, they are simply, in effect, injunctions to the mind. When you start operating with concepts, always put them together in forms like All S is P, no S is P, some S may be P, etc. Kant does not regard that as content, but simply a statement to the mind of how we should put together concepts. Now, of course, in the objectivist usage of concept, even the concepts that make up the categories are concepts, although they're not a priori, and in this sense, there's no such thing as a concept without content, but he would not say that. Somebody points out that I left out the name of the fourth set of categories, actually the third. The first three are the categories of quantity. That's unity, plurality, totality. The next three are the categories of quality, and that's reality, negation, limitation. The next three are the categories of relation, as they're called. And that was substance and attribute, cause and effect, and reciprocity. And the last three are the categories of modality, and that is possibility and impossibility, existence and non-existence, necessity and contingency. So the name I left out was categories of relation. Why isn't it universalizable to commit suicide? The consequences are unfortunate, but Kant isn't supposed to be considering consequences, is he? No, he isn't. I'll give you one of his forms of trying to prove that suicide is not universalizable. It occurs in his attempt to reformulate the categorical imperative to make it applicable to social situations. What should your attitude be to human beings? He there formulates what he calls the principle of humanity as an end in itself, according to which we must always treat every human being, whether in our own person or any other, always as an end, never as a means. This, he says, is alone universalizable, because if you tried to treat everybody as a means, then the question would be, means to what? Means to somebody's end, and you would be following a non-universal principle. You'd be treating some people as means to the others who are ends. Since that's not universalizable and you couldn't treat everyone as a means, it must follow that the only way to universalizable conduct is to treat everybody as an end. Now that includes yourself. Now, says Kant, what would be your motive for committing suicide? Well, let's suppose you're miserable, you're unhappy, you find life intolerable, and you say, I am going to take my life. Well, you are, says Kant, in that case, treating yourself as a means to an end, instead of an end in itself. You're treating yourself as a means to I think his exact words, if I remember, are as a means to a tolerable state of life. And you're not supposed to treat any human being, including yourself, as simply a means to an end. And therefore, taking your life because you're not happy would be making yourself a means to an end, namely happy. And that, of course, is wrong. You are to obey the categorical imperative because it's there. And the fact that you're miserable does not have anything to do with it. And therefore, in effect, simply to be rational is an end in itself, regardless of the consequences. And irrationality means not concerning yourself with consequences, but following the categorical imperative. Therefore, you shouldn't aim at happiness, and if you're not happy, he claims it follows you shouldn't commit suicide. That's the best I can do with suicide. I mean, with his Now, what is this? Why is the proof that categories exist necessary when Kant has to go about proving the existence of the specific categories? Well, because the specific categories in the metaphysical deduction, in fact, are not a proof of anything. If I simply read off to you 12 forms of judgment and say those forms of judgment involve certain concepts that make them possible, even supposing we were to grant that, the question would be, well, why, so what? Why couldn't those concepts derive from experience? Why do they have to be innate in the structure of the mind? So the purpose of the so-called metaphysical deduction is simply to give you the clue as to what the categories would be if there are any. It's simply the way of finding out what they would be if there were some. This is all the only way he could imagine that they would show up in the form of judgments. But then the question still is, well, how do you know those are categories and not just concepts derivable in principle from experience? Now, I left out still another part, which those of you heroic enough to remain in question this may as well know. In the transcendental deduction, he claims to show that certain categories are necessary in order that we're able to perceive spatial temporally. In metaphysical deduction, he reads off those a list of categories from the forms of judgment. And now the question he confronts is, how do you know that the categories that correspond to the forms of judgment are the ones that are required to make spatial temporal perception possible? So there's then a whole new section of the critique, which is called the analytic of principles, in which he takes them either one at a time or in groups of three, and tries to show that the very category that he got from the form of judgment is the very one that's necessary in order to experience space and time, so he brings the two together, you see. So what I call the metaphysical deduction is for him really simply the clue as to what the categories would be if there were any. When one hears three knocks with a sneeze in between, that of course was my own example. How does he retain memory of the sneeze if the synthesis discards irrelevancies? Well, he retains a memory of the sneeze, but he doesn't include it in that particular synthesis. He doesn't simply discard it. He makes his own synthesis. The sneeze itself has parts. For instance, at minimum, the person says, ah, choo. And he has two parts. So he maybe could perform a little quick synthesis of a choo. He gets the two parts, and that's its own. All I meant is not that he forgets it, but that he doesn't build it into the particular synthesis of the three knocks. Could you please clarify this point? I thought you said last week that concept that space and time are themselves categories which determine and structure experience. Now we find that they too have preconditions. What then is the status of time and space? No, space and time are not categories. Remember, he divides consciousness up into two levels, perceptual and conceptual. On the perceptual level, we have space and time. They are the a priori contributions, and they're called forms of sensibility. He does not regard those as concepts, but as forms of perceiving. Categories are the name for what's given on the conceptual level. Now, having made that distinction, he proceeds then to go on in the transcendental deduction and say that space and time on the perceptual level couldn't operate if it weren't for the operation of the categories on the conceptual level. And therefore, there isn't the sharp distinction between the two. One depends on the other. But he holds out to the end, you see, that we must perceive in certain ways, and that's the rock on which he validates the existence of the categories. The only way you could say space and time are categories is if you use category in a very loose sense, looser than Kant. To me, any a priori synthesizing form contributed by the mind, regardless of the level. And sometimes in colloquial parlance, if you can think of colloquial parlance in this connection, people call those categories, but strictly they're not categories. What is the basis of Kant's assertion that we perceive fragments rather than wholes? Also, if we perceive a face as a nose, eyes, ears, etc., is each of these also perceived as fragments, and each fragment as fragments, etc.? Well, that's a good question. What is the basis of his assertion that we perceive fragments rather than wholes? I would say that just is an obvious fact. It's at least obvious in the case of large wholes. You start off and you can't take it all in one glance. So far as I know, this is actually true, for instance, of the perception of a face. This much is true, that if you simply stare at any one point, you simply get that one point. And that as you perceive, to perceive a face, your eye roves from your forehead, cheek, lip, I'm just doing it right now, nose, etc. And it does it very rapidly and binds them together. So I think that simply the premise that we perceive in any given instant the direct sensation is one aspect, and then another, and then another, is, I think, actually true. The interpretation that he puts on it is, of course, entirely unwarranted, but that would involve criticism of the transcendental deduction, which I think I'll wait for next week. As far as how small does the fragment have to get, I don't know what he would say in answer to that. Presumably, insofar as it's extended at all, you could theoretically grasp one aspect without the other, but there's a certain bare minimum of what size, I don't know, beyond which you take it in just as one whole, because he does talk about, at least as a theoretical projection, the kind of creature who can get a momentary sensation, which must have some extent, some breadth, and therefore, presumably, he believes that there is some tiny unit that you can take in directly. How small that is, I don't know that he knows, that he has ever said. If all the categories make us think in a certain way and no other way, does Kant make an exception with the categorical imperative giving man a choice? No. He would say that the recognition that the categorical imperative is true is universal, and that you could get anyone, if he was honest, to confess, if he read Kant, that acting on universalizable principles is his moral obligation. In this sense, he thinks that the validity of the categorical imperative is universal, necessary, and no one who really thinks about morality could come to any conclusion other than the categorical imperative, just as he would say no one who thinks about the question of causality could come to any conclusion other than cause and effect. Of course, there are people who have denied cause and effect, like David Hume, but Kant would say he's counting upon it even when he denies it. And he would say the same thing with people who deny the categorical imperative. The difference, however, is that since the categorical imperative is a practical phenomenon, it governs how we should act, and he believes we have free choice. You have a choice as to whether to obey that or not, whether you're going to live up to it, in effect, or indulge your inclinations. So your area of choice, you do have an area of choice here that you don't on the theoretical level. You have no choice but to think in terms of the categories. You have a choice as to whether to obey the categorical imperative, but no choice as to whether to agree that it's true. In effect, you have a choice to be immoral, but no choice as to what morality consists of. If one is an end in himself, not a means, then why should one help others? If one did help others, he would in fact make himself a means to an end. Therefore, why didn't Kant consider selfishness a virtue? Well, that's because when he says that man is an end in himself, he doesn't mean anything remotely like what an objectivist would mean when he says each man is an end in himself. When an objectivist says each man is an end in himself, he means morality is a series of principles telling you how to achieve a certain end, namely your own life, welfare, happiness. And each man has a right to pursue his own life without interfering with others. That whole interpretation of man as an end in himself rests upon a completely different type of ethics, what Kant would call a hypothetical type of ethics. It rests upon the idea of setting up a goal of value and justifying actions on the grounds that they lead to it. And then objectivism adds that each man has a right to that goal for himself, and none should interfere with others, and therefore you should neither sacrifice yourself for others nor others for yourself. When Kant says man is an end in himself, he doesn't say it in any such context at all. He means, actually, adherence to reason, as he interprets it, is an end in itself. In other words, morally that would mean doing your duty is an end in itself, regardless of its consequences. And this means you must regard each man as an end in himself only in the sense of you must let him do his duty and mustn't interfere with his right to be rational as Kant construes it, which means to do his duty as Kant construes it. But one of those duties is that you should sacrifice yourself for others. And consequently, he would never derive selfishness out of his structure. The question implies a completely different view of what it means to say man is an end in himself. Selfishness, Kant invades against constantly, because selfishness implies you've got a goal that you want to achieve, and you're out to gain it, and that you justify your actions because of their results, because of something you want. Well, of course, that's acting from inclination. That's ignoring the fact that you should act from duty. That's ignoring the categorical imperative, etc., and that is out. I didn't follow your explanation of how Kant gets from morality to the existence of an afterlife and God. Is it simply because morality does not lead to happiness on earth? The best combination would be virtue and happiness, and therefore they must exist somewhere. And then where does God come from? Well, essentially, yes. He says, morality, being virtuous, doesn't lead to happiness here on earth. But it should. Our sense of justice tells us that it would only be right if virtuous men were happy. Of course, here on earth, they're miserable. Therefore, there must be another dimension to even up the moral scales, where moral men get their just rewards, and that implies that they're immortal and can inhabit this dimension. And there must be some supreme moral judge who's passing out the rewards and punishments, and that's where God comes in. Now, if you say, where does he come from? I don't know, because that's numinal, but that's where he comes in. So it's called a moral argument for God, you see, rather than a metaphysical. He isn't trying to show that by the nature of reality there must be a God, but by the nature of man's moral sense, we can have faith that there is a supreme being who will satisfy our moral aspirations. Last week, in answer to a question, you said that since the noumenal world is unknowable, one couldn't say if similar things in the phenomenal world corresponded to similar things in themselves in the noumenal world. When Kant speaks of a noumenal soul corresponding to a phenomenal soul, isn't he doing just this? Yes, he is. And of course, what can I say except he cannot speak about the noumenal world on his philosophy. So even his excursion via faith into the noumenal world is a violation of his philosophy. He would hasten to add, of course, he doesn't know what he means by a noumenal self in itself. You can't even think of it as existing, as one, as an entity, as subject to causality, as anything. But what can I do? When someone introduces the unknowable and then claims a means of access to it, all I can do as a presenter is present what he thought he had access to. And when you then say, but he said it was unknowable, I say, yeah, that's right. But he left that part out when he got to the next part and tried to cover it by saying it was a matter of faith. If our minds synthesize all fragments before we experience something, how can we experience fragments before the synthesizing activities of the mind? Well, we can get only what the salmon gets. In effect, a direct single fragment, whatever size that is. That in itself is not extended, does not require a synthesis. The fragment, as I used it, is whatever is the smallest unit that you could take in one sensation, which would not require any putting together. Now here is a good question which I consider an actually major objection to the whole transcendental deduction. You said that Kant claims that to perceive a whole one must have a concept of that whole, for instance face, to guide one's synthesis of what one actually observes. How, according to Kant, are such concepts acquired? If they are a priori, how can they deal with data that must be acquired by experience? Now, for example, the parts of a face. I'll tell you this much. In my own judgment, having on the basis of my reading of the critique and the commentaries, I don't think he has any answer in the world to this question. I think that the logical implication of his transcendental deduction is that all concepts have to be innate. Because it seems to me that what he's trying to prove is that percepts, since they involve synthesis, involve a rule which is the concept, and that therefore, in the case of any percept, whether a face, a series of knocks, a house, whatever it happens to be, you'd have to have the concept to have the percept. In which case you'd be in the position that all concepts are innate and none whatever are acquired by experience, which is just the position that Plato originally took. We're born with all concepts. Now, to be accurate, I should say, Kant vigorously denies this. He makes a rigid distinction between a priori concepts, which are the 12 categories, and empirical concepts, which he claims we get from experience. Now, I have asked a number of Kantians and engaged in lengthy discussion as to how could it possibly be that he claims we get concepts from experience, while simultaneously saying that experience is an experience of wholes and presupposes concepts. How could he possibly maintain that? And I can only report to you this. I have heard many sentences uttered by advocates of Kant that allege to be an answer to that question. I have never been able to retain one because I have not been able to follow one. And therefore, in my view, this objection is unanswerable. And the whole deduction would, if consistently carried out, lead him to the conclusion that all concepts are innate and a priori. I simply report he denies that. And there are Kantians who think he can somehow combine that denial with his view that concept is a rule governing synthesis which is required for percept. I haven't the faintest idea how that's possible. And this is essentially the same question. Well, let's close on this. Once Kant has derived the various categories and proved they are necessary, why does he have to prove that they will remain reliable? Why does he need the transcendental unity of apperception? Well, let's just say a word about that in conclusion. Well, because the categories, on the basis of the argument I presented, would be necessary only so long as space and time are necessary. Now, what was his, because they were shown to be the necessary conditions of space and time. Now, what was his proof that space and time are necessary? Simply that we could not now imagine a world without space and time. Simply as a brute fact, that's the way we're built. But that still leaves open to the Humean type the question, well, how do you know we'll be built that way tomorrow? So if we hang space and time on the categories on space and time, then the question just shifts to, but how do you know space and time have to continue just because up to now they're necessary? So we have to find something that in itself is necessary, and then the whole chain will proceed from it. a word about what the transcendental unity of apperception is, just so as not to leave you with an utterly mysterious phrase. It's a way, in effect, of saying self-consciousness. Self-consciousness. To give you just a rough clue here. Go back to the process where we're synthesizing the fragments, putting them together. It's not enough to reproduce fragment 1, let us say, from the series by the time you get to fragment 8. If you're to know that this is a series you experienced, you have to recognize, once you've reproduced that fragment, that this image that you've now produced stands for something which you experienced in the past, right? You have to know, as you reproduce the fragments, as you form the mental images, this represents something I experienced in the past. In other words, you have to have an enduring awareness that your I goes on. That's a capital I now. Your I, your ego, goes on across time. Because if it didn't, if you didn't have that awareness of yourself continuing across time, you wouldn't recognize that what you reproduced stood for what you had experienced before. Therefore, another thing required for synthesis is self-consciousness, which he calls apperception. Unity of self-consciousness. In other words, the same one I has to endure across time, and you have to know that. So, to perceive requires this self-awareness across time. Now, can we find this self by introspecting? No. Hume claimed to establish that when you introspect, you don't find an I. You find simply a series of experiences that succeed one another, but you never find a self. Therefore, this transcendental unity of apperception is a type of self-consciousness that we can't directly experience. Well, you might say, is it awareness of your noumenal self? No, because that's unknowable. So we're in this problem. We have to somehow know that our I endures across time, but we can't find the I in the phenomenal world, and we can't find the I in the noumenal world, but we have to find an I that goes on across time in order to engage in the synthesis. How could we find this? Now, this part I can't do much with in a minute, but in effect, he says, the only way we could be aware of the enduring I is if we were able to hold all the content together in one frame of awareness. If we could take the past and the present fragments and put them all together in one frame and hold it there, bind it all together, we would then see that we're the same as we were before, because we would see that we put all the fragments together in one frame of consciousness. So the unity of apperception that we require requires us to synthesize the data, and synthesis requires categories. That's a very, very brief indication of how it is supposed to come in. It's supposed to be in itself necessary for any consciousness which synthesizes data, because if it couldn't be aware of itself across time, it couldn't reproduce the past and recognize that what it was reproducing was the same as what it had experienced before, and then it would be back in the case of the salmon. That's as much as I can get in for tonight. As I say, we'll have a few more critical words on Kant next week. Thank you.
This course continues with Lecture 4.